why we started this conversation today with what's a community you belong to that's very close to your heart, where you experience belonging and what makes it special, is that the International Organization Development Association, IODA for short, is a community like that for me, for a variety of different ways. But let me tell you one or two things about this organization before we talk about the conference. IODA is a proper decolonized organization for community for OD practitioners. It's been organizing an annual conference since 1986, and I think it was formally founded in 1988. And it hosts a conference in a different continent, in a different part of the world, each year. And when you go to that country, it doesn't showcase necessarily all the American OD practitioners unless we're in America. And so we learn about organization development through local lenses, through experiencing what local organizations' challenges are, by meeting the local OD community in big numbers. And it's just the most wonderful group of people with the most wonderful rituals. One of them involves drinking a lot of unicum, which is a Hungarian drink, which is very close to Witblitz, for those of you in South Africa. On one night of the conference, the Hungarians always miraculously provide that. And it's been some of the most amazing friendships, professional friendships that I've had. And no matter how often you work together or collaborate, when you get to an IODA conference, it feels like you come home. So I haven't been to an IODA conference in person since before COVID. Before COVID, we hosted in South Africa in 2017. I went to a conference in India. We did an online conference with Assumption University, which is actually the biggest university teaching post-grad OD skills in the world right now, and they're in Thailand. But they also teach in China and used to teach in Myanmar as well, but they can't at the moment. And this year I was in Australia. Now, part of the history that I have with IODA is my father was one of the founding members of IODA in the late 80s. And so as I've grown up and as a little girl into a young adult, these people from IODA would always come and visit us and stay in our house. And that's part of where my love for organization development came from, because they were always the most amazing people, the most interesting people with the most interesting work and stories. So there's a little bit of my history. It was lovely to be in Geelong, which is close to Melbourne, but a kind of smaller city in Victoria in Australia. Kind of a big place to get to. I had other reasons to go as well, but it was just lovely to be there. So I'm going to share a couple of things about the IODA conference, but the first thing that I want to encourage you to do before we even finish or learn more about the conference is, if you like community and you want to meet amazing OD practitioners, we've had collaborations with some of these practitioners over the years in South Africa. I've been pulled into their work in other parts of the world. Consider going to the next OD conference, which will be in Mexico City in October 2024. So if you bookmark and look at iodanet.org, it's a place that you can join. But we're going to be hosted in Mexico City, and it's bound to be very interesting from the presentation that we already had. We have a ritual of handing over a quilt that's been made by IODA members, that's been passed on since 1988. And that quilt has now traveled from Geelong to Mexico. And the year after that, in 2025, we're coming to the African continent, and we'll be having a conference, a world summit with the ODN in Ghana. Our current president of IODA, Noble Kumau, is based in Ghana, and he's going to host us, and that's going to be absolutely amazing. So Mexico and then Ghana. And then you learn about OD from all over the world, not just from the American people that get published first. So just an idea of what the sessions kind of look like. Day one was really interesting. I'm going to talk quite a lot about this 1050 session with David Grieg and Kate Barlow. from an organization in Australia that do not-for-profit health insurance, and some of their organizational change journey. Joan Lurie also spoke about ecosystems and organizational change in interesting ways. So I'll talk quite a bit about that. In the parallel sessions, I chose to go to Jen Wilson's session on immunity to change. Some of you may be already aware of that, but I'll share one or two brief things about that. So I can't speak to the sessions I wasn't in. And then CJ, who is an American practitioner who spoke about diversity, equity, and inclusion from a class perspective and class bias, was really awesome. So that was more of our international day. Day 2 was run completely by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, and taught us more about Indigenous ways of being in organizations, of organizing, different ways in which organizations are changing in relation to the conversations between Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islanders. So very interesting sessions. I'm going to share quite a lot of learning from that. So this was fully immersed in part of the Australian reality. And then we had some sessions on day 3 as well. I went to a session called Empowering Work Environments, Contextual Designs that Leverage New Technology and Minimize Worker Displacement. And I'm not going to talk about it because I didn't understand it. It was on socio-technical systems change and deeply complex. And I'm still processing it. And I think I need to read about 7 books before I'll be able to speak about it. And then I did a session as well. And a lot of you have heard me speak about heat experiences. So I'm not going to speak about day 3 so much. I'll speak a little bit about Casey Kaminskij and what she shared. But I'm opting out of one of the conversations for now. So what you see here is part of the IODA traditions. It's one evening. In the background on the screen, we have our dear friend Frank from Germany, who's been composing a song for each conference since, I think, more or less 1988. He couldn't be there, but he was singing the song and we were drinking the Unakum. Before going out to some Australian comedy clubs after this, which is absolutely wonderful. And this is how our conference started with a ritual called Welcome to Country. And in particular, this ritual is a smoking ritual, in which the people of that part of the land, so one of the things that I learned is, I think that in Australia proper, there are something like 130 different languages spoken by different Aboriginal groups. So when you say the Aboriginal people, they are not a unified group. It's very much bound to country and language. And so what happens in the Welcome to Country ceremony is people are welcomed onto the land, and the people whose land that is, they are named very specifically. And later on, we'll hear about why this is so significant in the history of Australia. But this was just a really beautiful ritual and ceremony. It involves creating a fire and then putting the ever-present eucalyptus leaves over the fire to not burn them and to create a whole lot of smoke, which is the particular smell of, I think, Australia is very eucalyptus-based. And then people who wanted to particularly arrive in country and acknowledge country could come and just be with the smoke. And it was a really significant way to start before any other formalities. And it has a lot to do with authorizing voice and who welcomes you into a space, as opposed to rank and hierarchy, really acknowledging country and land as very important. And the Wadawurrung people whose land we were on ran the ceremony for us, and we'll learn more about their reality as well. Last bit of IODA gushing. We have certain awards that get given every year, and Rod Barnett, who is an amazing OD practitioner that has been in the field for now almost 35 years. He's still going strong and doing work in Australia. At the moment, he's working in a mining project in Namibia as well. He got honored in one of the awards for his contribution to the organization, and then an award to Onmar Mio Aung, who couldn't be there, who's an OD practitioner from Myanmar, who does OD work and change management work inside organizations in Myanmar. She has now been banned from the country because of the politics and what's happening there, and the kind of liberal values of organization development around diversity and inclusion are seen as threats by the current regime. And she is learning how to practice OD through people who are still allowed to be in the country and continuing work inside organizations, and in particularly also working for societal change. So we think sometimes we've got big challenges. Imagine trying to do work in your country for change while being banned from the country and having to work through other people. So an amazing OD practitioner who was honored in her absence as well. And that's the award that she won is actually an endowment award that actually gives her money to allow her to continue her work, which is really awesome. So the first session I want to talk about was run by David Greeff and Kate Barlow, and their organization is a not-for-profit health insurer that is very old. I can't remember, I didn't write down exactly when they started, but from memory, it's somewhere in the 1920s. And they were started by cement workers, basically a labor-initiated health insurer at that point in time. And they've been going now for almost 100 years, if I have my dates in memory correct. And what they experienced in 2020 was a decline in their core business. And they knew this because part of what happened is their broker channel became completely unsustainable. So this happens in insurance quite a lot, but also a decline in the number of clients joining and the number of clients staying, despite them being a not-for-profit health insurer with strong links to specific regional communities. So they're not for the entire Australia, they're regionally based. And part of how they made sense of what got them into trouble, other than the financial pinch that came from COVID, is that they had embarked on an agile journey 4 years before this for all of their organizational management. And basically what agile meant is they got completely gridlocked because they were doing 100 things 1% at a time and not finishing anything. And so this idea of how can we get back to our core culture, our connection to our community, but also to being an accountable organization was really core to what they wanted to do. And they had a new CEO, David Greeff, who was there and speaking at the conference alongside his head of people, Kate Barlow. They were speaking together about the story, that the journey they'd been on. And what I loved is they spoke separately and they hadn't aligned on what they wanted to say quite deliberately, so that the third part of their presentation could be to make sense of what they had both said and to respond to that, which I thought was like really authentic. And they had a very interesting conversation about their different personalities while they were doing it. So what he particularly shared, so some of his perspective. The first thing is that when he joined and all of these things were going down and the indicators were looking bad for the organization, he realized that he had to embark on a big change and transformation journey for the organization. And he worked with his coach. And the first thing the coach said was, so have you got a burning platform? Because that's what it starts from. And the very next thing he did was to fire that coach. And in particular, he said, this is not an organization that needs to base its change on fear and burning platforms. We all know what the burning platform is. I'm not going to enhance it. I want to get a positive message. And I want to base this transformation on something we're moving towards, something we can all be excited about. And so the core theme that he used for this change was rediscovering our remarkable. And basically, it was a values-driven process centered on people's strengths and centered on social justice, because it's such a community-based health insurer as well. And they focused on just two values. The first was be remarkable, and the second is be focused. Be remarkable and be focused. And as part of this journey, they had a lot of different things. So David spoke extensively about how it was important for him to not work with employees, but with humans. And I heard a lot of existential themes in the conversation in a really beautiful way. So some of the practices to bring humanity and belonging back into the organization, the one is called coffee roulette, which is basically on a specific day where there's something blocked in everyone's calendars called a coffee date. And on that day, you get assigned a random other person in the organization, and you have to go have coffee with them on that day in that time slot. So coffee roulette. The second thing was when they started working from remote to return to office, they incorporated family events into return to office. So they had family socials, and that allowed the family system to come back into the organization, not just the people working in the organization. And then a specific event that I think has now become quarterly called Meet the Makers. And Meet the Makers is a day on which everyone that has a side hustle in the organization, a passion, a hobby, you know, a coffee station, a mobile coffee station that you employ someone to run, whatever it is, that you bring your side hustle into work and show other people what it is you make, what it is you do, from food to art to music to whatever, in different ways. And I think that's also interesting because many organizations block the side hustle, and it's a way of bringing passion. And that was a theme across multiple speakers, how connecting on what we're passionate about is a bio-neurochemical hack into belonging and connection. And so if I can showcase my passion, that's part of what builds community in an organization. The second leg that they based their transformation on was collective capability. And here they did general staff development. A lot of that was based on in-task collaboration projects to encourage systemic leadership. So basically from silos working together to solve problems in more of a facilitated context, with the assumption that it would be risky and hard and people would fight. And to completely normalize that, and the principle there was, if we can work together on practical things, we'll connect and we'll get back to being remarkable and being focused. They did leadership development, more traditional stuff, but importantly, they took their core leadership community into wilderness, into nature, and had them do a variety of different activities that allow them to connect. They don't work with the Enneagram, they work with the Herman brain dominance profile, but that was part of their leadership development. But leaders in the wild, definitely much more of a heat experience, a team that works together, having to collaborate and survive together. Of course, I love that kind of stuff, so I was very excited to see and hear more about that. The third leg of their journey was to connect into the community they're serving. And what they got is they got leadership from the community to come and do talks inside the organization. They actively encouraged volunteering and rewarded people for volunteering in local community organizations. They sponsor the things their local community cares about most, which happens to be Australian rules football. And the Geelong team is sponsored by them, and they were playing in some or other final while we were there, which meant that we lost our host for the last hour of the conference because he went to a football match. But I make sense of that because I think he's an Enneagram 7. Lovely in front of a group, but always on his way somewhere else. And then they also did tours in which, through the community, where they got local community members to tell the story of different parts of the community, from very specifically from people who'd been in the community for a long time. They serve a community that used to have a Ford automotive plant that then closed down, and then had some other industry that then closed down too. So there's a long history in this region of big employers disappearing, and also a lot of trauma in relation to the Aboriginal community there. So walking tours, telling the story of places that used to be used for other things and the history of the town and connecting people to that. And so the core of where the content of the change was dealt with was in-task collaboration, and then a specific reorg piece, which was around the bonus and variable REM structure that was disconnecting people. So they flattened their REM structure significantly and instituted organization-wide bonuses for reaching organizational goals, as opposed to individual performance rating-based bonuses. So that changed quite significantly. Now, what the head of people said about this change, so this is what the CEO said. What the head of people said is every single meeting she had with him in the time when they were deep in this project was, what are the results, Kate? And this was part of the, like, drinking your champagne, be focused, be remarkable. So he started from that. And so she knew that she had full reign to do very interesting things to bring their culture back into where it needed to be, believing that through doing that, a lot of the performance will be sorted. But she had to answer the question on the impact, so very outcomes-oriented, like almost an achiever performing mindset in the CEO. And part of what her job was to keep acknowledging to people that if you want to be remarkable, you need to stick your neck out. If you're not sticking your neck out, even though there's a culture in a lot of Australian organizations around don't be a tall poppy, if you're not sticking your neck out, you're not being remarkable. So what are the conversations you need to have? What are the problems you need to tackle that have to do with being remarkable? And they instituted rituals for celebrating trickiness. So in meetings, after a tough conversation, they started the ritual where they had to end off the tough conversation with what I appreciate about working with you. And that became part of what allowed a celebration of some of the trickiness. The core principle of being in the trenches together, doing work together, was what they assumed would help people solve a lot of the problems. And then some cultural language. They have done away with the idea of being a good corporate citizen. They said, if I'm encouraging you to be a great corporate citizen, I'm probably not encouraging you to be a good human being in your community and in your family. So don't be a good corporate citizen, be a good human at work, at home, in your community. The second part of language is they used to have a strong family-based language. So a lot of organizations that have 100 years of history have family-based language. We're a big family, we get along together. And they stopped that. Then we're not a family. We're an organization of care and accountability. And that's the language that they replaced it with, because they said family kept us stuck in being nice to each other. And that wasn't helping us along. So it kept us from having some of the tricky, tough conversations. And so they really believed that they can change without changing by tapping into the emotions of care and people-centeredness, that things would come right. They lost some of their long-standing employees, which was very, very hard. Not as many as they thought they would lose. And what they did is when employees came to them saying, I don't like this change, I want to go back to the family setting, is the CEO had personal conversations with him in which he said, stick it out for 6 months. And if you still want to leave, you'll go with my blessing and with, my recommendation on your resume, but give me 6 months, which I think is a very interesting approach. And he personally spoke to everyone that wanted to leave. Yeah. So I'll stop the share there for a moment and then just ask any questions or comments. It's a wonderful case study, very locally based. I really enjoyed it. The conversation between the two of them was all about being in alignment, despite being very different in personalities. And having to model all the behaviors that they wanted. They didn't make it complex. They shared the results of what's happened to the organization. They feel they're out of the deadlock of agile. They've let go of saying we're an agile organization. They still use some of those principles, but David said 100 times, my job as CEO is to make sure the organization is focused on the right things. And he said the change was driven by focusing on culture. And the results seem to show it. So, yeah, all the right numbers are going in all the right directions. And they're seeing better numbers of people joining and retention than they've seen since before COVID even. So, yeah, thoughts, questions, comments, observations. How does this relate to some of your client work and organizational change? Or just anything that you take from that. Kate?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a great example of culture eats strategy for breakfast.
Yes.
It's very like strongly around the how, you know, it all seems very focused on the how. It wasn't even about the vision per se. There was a little bit of task collaboration, but it was all how are we doing things together? And I was fascinated that Agile could gridlock an organization. Right? Because I've never heard, I mean, Agile, yeah, some organizations struggle to get Agile working well, but like for it to gridlock a system, it's quite an interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, in my experience, it actually happens quite often. I think Agile, if done properly, is incredibly beautiful and empowering. Agile is very seldom done properly. And I think when organizations scale Agile out of the dev space into a way of running a whole organization, it can create chaos and a lack of focus in many ways. And very few organizations have managed to become Agile organizations. So Agile development, very powerful, hard to scale, which is why you've got things like SAFe and very weird versions that aren't Agile that are called Agile, but that's another conversation. But it can do it in some way.
And the last thing is I'm really intrigued by the family comment, because I mean, we come across that so often, right? Organizations that have grown up and that are now 800 people, but they still all talk about being a family, and then they really struggle to have the tough conversations. So I think that's so interesting, and I can see, it feels very applicable to one of my clients.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think family language mostly belongs inside conforming conforming parts of an organizational culture, where language of care and accountability, that starts pushing me more into performing, specializing beyond and performing language. So for me, a lot of conforming stuckness comes from family language.
Makes a lot of sense. Thanks, Lucille. Super interesting.
Joe, Lita, Rikus, well, I just wave at me quickly if you still want to speak. So Joe, and then, okay.
Lucille, so yeah, I agree. That was very interesting. And I'm interested in where the two individuals who led this process got the confidence and the experience to walk forward with this confidently, knowing, I don't know, did they know it was going to work? Where they threw away some kind of old tried and tested methods, Agile family, that kind of stuff, and went with more novel thinking. Where they pulled it out from, know, experience or great insight or great maturity or
So this is curious. The head of people, quite experienced, she hadn't been in this organization a super long time, but had big organization experience and so had a lot of confidence. David, the CEO, is a first-time CEO. And so he comes from not completely an OD kind of background, but more OD-ish than just accounting. So part of his undergraduate studies were in these kinds of fields, but he's a first-time CEO, and sometimes first-time CEOs do remarkable things. I'm experiencing that in a client we're working with at the moment, where two of the new heads of divisions that are brand new in that level of rank are doing things that are leaving the experienced person far behind because they already stuck in the rote ways of doing. Yeah. And so he was also saying the organization is doing so badly, we've got nothing to lose. What have we've been trying up to now? Let's not do more of that. So let's change. Yeah. But he was lovely. He came back to the conference for other days. He didn't just come up and present and then leave. He was there in other sessions too, which also tells you something about him. Yeah. Miriam Rickus.
What I wanted to say was that as a first-time CEO, I find that interesting, is that they don't have that baggage with the company, and they don't have that piece of the ego about I did this right. So it's very interesting because it's, yeah, they can play more.
Yeah. And that's my sense. He really came into this from a positive perspective rather than some carrot and stick or whatever. It's a genuine, heartfelt, let's change from a good base rather than fear. It's not my values.
That's really great. Wow. And then he was willing to talk. These two people were willing, their willingness to just have that conversation and be public. That's a big deal.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
It's a big deal because it's interesting. One of my clients is doing some work, and what he's doing is he's speaking to this team in private and then speaking to this team in private. And I called him on it, and he said, oh, no, I didn't mean to do that. And I said, really?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, think about that when we talk about our next presentation. Lita, anything you want to share?
I was just thinking, has personality to do anything to do with wanting to be part of a community, of a bigger community? Because for me, I don't really miss being part of a big group. I prefer to be in a small group.
Yeah.
Unless we're there for the same purpose.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we talk the same language.
I think the core thing is you have personality differences. I'm sure a lot of people with Enneagram 5 in their profile might not have enjoyed the idea of showing up with some things in public. But the core thing is that community is part of their reason for existence. So as a not-for-profit, community-centered health insurer, that's part of their purpose. So, there's a larger thing than just preference that I think plays into a lot of what they focused on. Rickus, anything you want to still share?
I was just wondering, initially it seemed that a major part of the problem was the move to the agile, making everything agile. But fixing things didn't seem to directly address that. Be remarkable and focused doesn't tell me how one moves away from agile again into something else.
Yeah,
that works well.
Yeah, my
Did
sense
they just
is
stay with agile?
My sense is they didn't lose or keep agile. They kind of said, let's not be stuck in the methodologies. Let's go back to relationships. Okay. Which is interesting because that's one of the agile principles, right? People over process. So they just let go of the process versions of agile that seem to have proliferated in the organization. And they actually went back to the core principle of agile and rebuilt relationships. And then didn't need to name it anything, but kept going. We're not working on 100 things at once. So there was a process of making sure that we're working on sizable chunks that we can actually shift, which is also an agile principle. So I think maybe they were just doing agile really badly. And once they stopped calling it agile, they started doing it properly and they don't even know they're doing it now.
Okay.
Yeah, that's my sense.
Well, as long as it works.
Yeah, as long as it works, which is a very agile way of looking at it. So the second presentation I want to share with you was by a very interesting woman. Just a quick South African shout out, GMHBA, the organization, are working with Vitality as of a couple of months ago. So David's actually been coming to South Africa and working with one of our big organizational exports, Vitality, which is pretty cool. So Joan Lurie, her topic was organizations as an ecology and the need to develop ourselves as organizational ecologists is what I want to speak about next. And she used this video that I'm going to share as part of her presentation to help us understand ecologies and how ecologies work. So here we go. Okay.
One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom. And the classic example is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park in the United States when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now, we all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to many others. Before the wolves turned up, they'd been absent for 70 years. That the numbers of deer, because there was nothing to hunt them, had built up and built up in the Yellowstone Park, and despite efforts by humans to control them, they'd managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They'd just grazed it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer, but that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behavior of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be trapped most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges. And immediately, those places started to regenerate. In some areas, the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. Bare valley sides quickly became forests of aspen and willow and cottonwood. And as soon as that happened, the birds started moving in. The number of songbirds and migratory birds started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And beavers, like wolves, are ecosystem engineers. They create niches for other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed coyotes, and as a result of that, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers. Ravens and bald eagles came down to feed on the carrion that the wolves had left. Bears fed on it too, and their population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on the regenerating shrubs. And the bears reinforced the impact of the wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer. But here's where it gets really interesting. The wolves changed the behavior of the rivers. They began to meander less. There was less erosion. The channels narrowed, more pools formed, more riffle sections, all of which were great for wildlife habitats. The rivers changed in response to the wolves. And the reason was that the regenerating forests stabilized the banks so that they collapsed less often, so that the rivers became more fixed in their course. Similarly, by driving the deer out of some places and the vegetation recovering on the valley sides, there was less soil erosion because the vegetation stabilized that as well. So the wolves, small in number, transformed not just the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, this huge area of land, but also its physical geography.
Okay, so very interesting. very interesting. And this was a Jones analogy for an ecological approach to organizational change. Now, in the presentation, I've popped a link to some of her articles. I think it's something that's useful to grapple with. I'm still grappling with some of it, so I'm not going to do it all justice. And she spoke much longer than I'm going to speak about it. But a couple of things that I'll highlight. The first is that her ecological view, she's always looking at three things. She's looking at the system, the individuals in the system, and the roles in the system. So she speaks about role as the place where you can affect change quite a lot. Now, first, how does she define system? It's a set of relationships within a boundary. So within an organizational boundary, as an example, or within a team boundary, within a community boundary. So a set of relationships within a boundary. So if you go in to study things from an ecological perspective, you need to study the relationship between things, like in that video. What's the relationship between the wolves and the behavior of the deer? Yeah. So then she says the individuals in those systems are the carriers of mental maps of how the system works and what their roles in it are. And what's a role? A role is either explicit or implicit, but she says the implicit rules are the big ones. And the implicit role is how I see the system and the rules that governs the system. So if we use that example as well, the wolves take on the role of killing the deer. And that pushes the deer out of certain spaces. Now, the deer's ability to hold the map of where I should be and where I shouldn't be, where I get killed and when I don't get killed, is part of how the individual's map of that system works. So this is part of what she shared. Ecologically, you look at the system, the roles within it, and the maps that the individuals carry within that system. Then what she said from that point, from an ecological point, the first thing is that when you do change in an organization, the problem statement creates the reality or the map that we solve from. And from the moment that we have that problem statement in a certain way, so the problem here is that Agile, we'll use the previous example, is keeping us stuck as an organization. What can often start happening is we start screening out everything that doesn't fit our map, that the problem is Agile, because we've put it in a problem statement. And so she says problem statements should not be based on a thing, but based on an exploration of how the roles are interacting with each other, circular loops. Yeah. So she says problem statements should be circularly defined. So this leads to this, leads to this, leads to this, leads to that. That kind of circular thinking, good problem statements, pinning it to ground. The problem is that, not so good, because then we screen out all the data that doesn't fit with it. And if it's a complex system, like organizations are, it very rarely is true. And then she said, what's useful as an OD practitioner is for you to look at the implicit feedback loops that keep the system stuck. And so feedback loops could be, let's say marketing and sales are having an argument with each other. They feel they're not collaborating on some kind of thing. You know, there's a way in which sales reinforces sales behavior in a certain way and reinforces the marketing behavior. And there's a way in which marketing's behavior is reinforcing their behavior and the behavior of sales in this loop. So if we can figure out that the way that we are, so let's say the marketing team says they're not following our process because we haven't communicated it clearly enough. And we just keep sending formal comms, which then, you know, that's the behavior that we've got, which in some way doesn't necessarily reinforce behavior change. It's a feedback loop that says something else. So then what the salespeople do, like salespeople are, it's like, oh, more formal comms from marketing. Let's ignore it. They don't want to speak to us, really. They're just sending us these formal comms all the time. Yeah. And so we can see how, and then marketing feels more ignored, so that they send more formal comms, and so we're in this kind of loop. And when we're looking at these feedback loops, we can think of the rules that this organization is playing by. You know, you don't just reach out and have a conversation, you send formal comms, might be an implicit rule. What are the roles people take on? What are the relationships between people? So she then says that if you can change the role people play in the system, you will change the pattern and change the culture. How do you change a role? You change the mental map an individual carries of that organization in themselves. So if you can help marketing see the feedback loop and their role in it, your role is not to send formal comms to get sales to comply. My role is to build a relationship that enables them to understand our needs. Now I've changed the mental map in some way. And so that's what enables organizational change. So roles define the behavior required. So role contracts are very important. So she's talking about marketing and sales need to contract with each other both ways around how they're going to do things differently, to change the roles, to change the behaviors. Yeah, and a lot of the work in an ecological perspective is to not describe things in a way that has to do with the person's identity. You're a tank. It's behavioral descriptions. You act like a tank. So if it's not about you not being a tank, it's about you changing the behavior of a tank, and that makes it a lot less personal and a lot less easier to get into these things. So I am not yet personally 100% sure how I work with all of this. And I'm going into a project next week in Kruger, where I know I'm going to be listening for the role-to-role contracts in the workshops. And I'm going to experiment with that and going to try and see if we can go from topics as problems. The problem is not paying compliments. It's one of the Kruger problems. To going to what's the behavioral loop that we want to describe, which is, you know, the rangers don't salute when someone of rank walks past, which then gets ignored, which then reinforces that it's not important to salute, which leads to a disintegration of discipline, which is what paying of compliments means in a military system. So we're going to look at that, and I'm going to be very suspicious of anything that gets named a problem that's a topic, and see if we can change the problem statements. And I'm very happy to report back. Any thoughts or questions or comments based on an ecological view, or even just the video, and what this makes you think of in terms of some of the work that you do? Let's just hear one or two comments. Miriam? Oh, sorry, I thought you'd unmuted. Anyone else that wants to share something?
It actually makes sense to me that when the deers were chased to the higher areas, that the valleys were filled with those who belong there.
Yeah.
Deers are supposed to be on the outskirts, and it makes sense if you look at nature, that if we're not in synergy with each other, if even in nature, if things are not synchronizing, then you get this uneven thing. And I think it's what's happening. Many people say this is aardverwarming.
Yeah, global warming.
I personally feel it's maybe because we're not kind to Mother Nature.
Yeah, well, maybe we don't have enough apex predators coming to get us, which is a different view. But I think the interesting thing around this is, and what I inferred, but I did not hear Joan say, is if you can change the mental map of the system,
yes.
of the senior leaders in the organization, you can change the system quite easily in some way. Because if the CEO or the CIO's definition of the problem shifts, then their role in relation to it will shift.
Yes.
And that's like the apex predator introduction in some kind of way. And I think that's what a lot of executive coaching has the potential to do, is to help us work with senior leaders to rethink our problem statements. Isn't that what good coaching does? And if we can think about problem statements in circular behavioral terms, then maybe we're enabling something that's a lot more ecological from a leadership perspective.
And my reference is government only.
Yes.
And there you're not supposed to oppose. You must just keep quiet and follow the rules.
Well, I mean,
So,
there's a whole set of roles.
Which made me always part of the outer group, of the out group, because I think about the things, and I don't necessarily disrespect your rank, but if your thinking is not working, then I don't keep quiet.
Yeah. Well, now the core job would be to get, for example, top management to reframe the role of people in different parts of that bureaucratic system to include challenge, as an example. So I've got quite a few things I still want to share, so I'm going to move on, if that's okay. And I'm going to share something that maybe many of you are familiar with, but I was familiar with it, but I felt out of touch with it, and that's Keegan and Lay's immunity to change specific process for helping clients get unstuck when they know they've got a clear goal. So where immunity to change is useful is where you've got a client with a very clear goal, and they believe in their goal, and they're committed to their goal, and they're still not able to follow through on it. Yeah. So how do we then work with it? So the core of this process is you start by defining your commitment. What's the improvement goal you're going for? And then you need to list the behaviors. What am I doing or not doing instead of the stuff that's going to support my goal? Yeah. Because I'm doing other stuff. You know, if I'm committed to getting fit and, you know, I'm not going to the gym, as an example, then I'm not doing something that would support my improvement goal. And then what you unpack from that is, what are the hidden commitments that explains the behavior I'm actually doing versus the behavior I want to do, but I'm not doing. So if I'm not going to the gym, what's the commitment that's actually that I have that's leading to me not going to the gym? We'll look at another example in a moment. And then you unpack your big assumptions that allows you to in some way change the way in which you relate to your actual behaviors, not the commitment that you're not enacting properly. So here's an example that's used often in this community. So the commitment is, as a leader, I want to delegate more. I want to clarify outcomes desired. So there's a whole lot of delegation type stuff, right? What am I doing instead? I let new opportunities distract me, adding to my list of things I need to do. I accept more tasks and sacrifice non-work related things. I don't balance my time. I don't ask people to help me. What are the hidden competing commitments that explain the actual behavior? Yeah. So different things come up there. I fear missing a good opportunity. So FOMO, Enneagram 7 kind of stuff. I'm committed to being independent and capable of anything. So no wonder I'm not delegating. Yeah. So I fear letting my team down. And there, I'm committed to being selfless. I dislike leaving boxes unchecked. I'm committed to always finding a way to get it done. Now, if I'm committed to being independent, selfless, and always getting it done, can you see how logical it is for me that I'm not following through on my desire to delegate? So what are the big assumptions driving that? So if I'm dependent, it's like fear-based. So I fear that if I'm dependent on others, and unable to do many things well, I will lose my self-respect. If I put myself first, I'll become what I dislike in others, superficial and trivial. If I don't find a way to get things done, I'll stop being valuable. And then we can work on reframing those assumptions to help me go back to delegating. So really, are there ways in which delegating can help you get self-respect? Are there ways, so can you see how this can support a coaching conversation? Really lovely. You can get these sheets, immunity to change sheets on the web. There's a lovely article on HBR that also explains the process in more detail, but just a nice practical tool. It was lovely to be reacquainted to it. We had to do immunity to change maps for ourselves in the process. And we created and we shared it with another individual, which was really lovely. And we've been checking in with each other on how we're doing there. But here's two things that Jen said that I just thought were very powerful in general for our field and our workshops and our work. So these are just, let's call it nuggets. So the first thing she said is, it's okay to feel uncomfortable and important to feel safe at the same time. So what a lovely both and. It's okay to feel uncomfortable and it's important to feel safe. So let's talk about it when you don't feel safe in this process. And then this is her definition of confidentiality. She says the learning can leave with you, but the stories stay here, which I also thought is just very simple, beautiful way to help people think about what they talk about and what they don't talk about. The learning leaves, the stories stay here. So that's a different way of saying Vegas. Yeah, then talking CJ, what a lovely guy. Just really, this is why I go to IODA conferences, to meet amazing people like CJ and his wife, who was also traveling with him. And the first thing that he did in this was a plenary exercise, is he said, find someone in the group you don't know, and we paired up with each other. And he said, identify for yourself, what's one thing you're really passionate about in your life? Really love. It doesn't have to be work related. Anything that's core to your identity. You love it so much. And then you go stand with the other person. You say, I am really passionate about fishing. Ask me about it. And the person will ask and ask questions. And then we reverse the exercise as well. And it was lovely because it built instantaneous connection. And it's kind of a hack for later that evening when we were all in an awkward social setting with each other. Instead of just talking to the people you already know, I knew I could go and talk to this person about that, and we could explore from there. So it's like kind of a hack for getting to know people and building connection. But it also, talking about what you're passionate about, changes your neurochemistry. So it also makes you like the people more when you meet them. So just that was really lovely. And CJ's just published a book called What's Your Zip Code Story, which has a very nice different entry point based around class, and what your zip code that you were born in tells you about who you are. And ask me about exercises around zip codes rather than entering with very hard conversations around race. So he said specifically, class and race are intersectional in many ways. It's not a completely the same thing, but they're intersectional. And he said, because racism is an ideology in which one group is better than the other, and it can be very heated to enter into conversations around race. It's interesting to also enter some of the conversations around class. What he said on top of it is that sometimes race actually hides differences on class. So he says, I might be an African-American male that grew up in this kind of zip code, and here I have another African-American male who grew up in a very different kind of more privileged zip code. And so if you assume that we have the same lived experience in an organization when it comes to leadership, you'll be wrong, because privilege is not just about race, right? And what he spoke about a lot is this idea of a class migrant. So a class migrant is the first person in a family to travel into, for example, out of a working class into more of a white collar job. or, you know, into more of a leadership in a different economic circumstance. Out of, in South African context, we'll talk about out of the township and into the suburbs. Yeah. So class migrants. And he said, when people are class migrants, one of the first things that they suffer quite a lot is imposter syndrome and feeling that they don't belong in the community or organizational context that they find themselves in, which can lead to a whole set of problematic behaviors. Part of it is that I don't understand the unspoken or invisible rules. I don't have the same kind of relationships and sponsorship in the system. And I might try harder to affirm my expertise and therefore be less open to some of the more collaborative problem solving, because I'm trying to prove that I belong there and expertise is the way to do it in an organizational context. And he says, when you have some of those challenges of class migration, often what happens is the group that's migrating into the organization gets stuck at the middle management level because, in part, they don't have the right sponsorship and they don't get the right mentoring to enable them to learn how to navigate a system they didn't grow up in. Yeah. And part of what this is also about is if there are not a lot of references of people in leadership in the system like me, whatever that is, then that's also challenging. And so it makes the scaffolding even more acute. And our connections into the system are different. Who you know has power. And if I'm a migrant and I know almost no one, then it is very different for me to learn how to navigate the system. Now, because we're in intersectional territory, not all of this is only relevant to class, but being specific about class as an entry point enables conversations in a way that he says, open up a lot of the stuff around race as an experience, but without the ideological baggage that comes with it. And so he's found this really empowering. And the ways in which he operationalized it, so maybe a little bit of traditional conventional thinking here. He calls it his CARDS methodology, which is all about curiosity, awareness, rituals, drivers, systems. And so I'm not going to get stuck on that too much. But what I liked around the rituals is Ask Me About It is a type of ritual, making sure that the photos on the walls of the organization are not all just, for example, white and male and whatever. That's part of what enables that. But then behaviors around mentoring and very deliberate sponsorship is something that he spoke about quite a bit. So just a quick stop and check anything around Keegan and Leahy or CJ's entry point through class. His book is available on Audible and on Kindle as well if you want to read more about What's Your Zip Code Story. So I've started listening to it. I'm early days in the book because I've just come back from the mountains and I wasn't listening to anything there. So yeah, any questions or comments? Keegan and Leahy and CJ Gross.
I love that key community to change. I forget about it. So thank you for reminding me. Yeah. It's great work. Yeah.
For me, in one of the organizational systems and insurance company we're doing a lot of work in at the moment, there's one of the people on the diversity council, whatever they're called, one of the bodies where people volunteer to support the EE plan and a lot of other things. He's been harping on in sessions so much about class not being spoken about enough. And I think in some context, the conversation around race or gender or LGBTQIA plus topics much more in frame than class. And I look forward to experimenting with some class entry point conversations. And I just like the hack of going for a passion as an icebreaker in workshops that I think we can all use as well. So some great ideas there. Okay. only spoken about day 1 of the conference. So I'm not going to speak much about day 3, but I want to speak about day 2, which was all about the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. And maybe not everything I'm going to say is going to be linked directly to a specific session, but I've kind of pulled the learning into more of an integrated whole. The first thing is that we were introduced to a mindfulness movement practice inspired by Indigenous practices called Wayap Awurk. And there is an article with some videos that shows you how to do a Wayap Awurk mindfulness practice. So it is an embodied practice, so you move in the practice. And basically, the purpose of the practice is to help you to connect to country and land wherever you are. I love the language of Australia, which is not connect to the country, connect to the land. It's connect to country. And there's an immediacy in there that's quite beautiful. So the person who's leading this mindfulness practice will take you through different aspects of country, like creation itself, like earth, like sun, moon, rain, and then invite you to move. So if we're connecting to rain, find a movement that helps you to connect to rain. And the rain falls harder, and the rain is very gentle, you know. And so as a group, there's no right movement, but you're all moving through natural elements. And that was just, it was about a 25-minute mindfulness practice, I think. Really beautiful. We did it at the start of the second day and got us all into a very present but very embodied mindset. My personal learning from that was that lightning was tiring for me. So the kind of lightning stuff, and given that I have quite a fierce personality, it helped me realize that I'm actually tired of some of the lightning strikes that are embodied inside me. But that's a complete aside. Go look at it if you're interested in mindfulness practices. There are 3 different videos that you can look at, and it speaks about the origins of the practice as well. Then just some of the general learnings from the conversations. One of them was the practice of a message stick, which comes from old Indigenous ways, which is a specific piece of wood that would be carved as a gift to a tribe in a different territory that you would take with you to ask as permission to enter territory, to cross a boundary. And it's a particular role to have, to be the person who's allowed to carve the message sticks, to make the message sticks. But what it made me think of is, what are the rituals and the ways in which we ask permission to cross boundaries? And how can we work with crossing of boundaries in more sacred and mindful ways? So the other part of working with this idea of message stick is, who is the authorizing voice? So carving the message stick and then sending a message stick in return to say you've been welcomed across the boundary comes from particular skill sets, but also from the respect of the community, to say you're seen as a wise elder, for example. It's not the young Turks that get to carve the message sticks all the time. And to ask the question around systems we're in, or who's the one giving me permission to be in the system if I'm an external person coming in? And are those the only authorizing voices we need? Are there other people we need to ask for permission as well? Then I'm very familiar with processes of council. Just in Australia, the words used for it is a yarning circle, which is also just beautiful language, a yarning circle, which I don't know exactly everything it connects to, but for me, it's the idea of weaving, right? I'm yarning, I'm pulling the threads together. And some of the things that they said, and we experienced some yarning circles in the sessions as well, is a yarning circle has no hierarchy. It's all about who is the thread now and respecting that. But they also said very deliberately, is when you're in a yarning circle and you yarn to get to agreement, you have to slow down or you will polarize. So if the pace of your yarning is too quick, then it will polarize. And if I think of polarization in the world at the moment, what a beautiful invitation to go to not polarize. We don't have to say different things. We need to slow it down so we can hear it differently. So really beautiful there. Then, how do the Aboriginal people refer to themselves in their collective? They call themselves a mob, which is just such, I want to use this language too. And they say the mob pulls me into community. So when I go off by myself, the mob pulls me back into community. And how can we be a mob for each other? But the mob also gives me permission to be quite outrageous, I think, sometimes. Yeah. And one of the places we went to in walking around Geelong was to a particular building that has been, they call it, it's a building that houses many different artists and their studios. But it's a blackout project, which means that every single person who has a studio in that building is an Aboriginal artist. So it's a blackout of the building. And on the steps, as you enter, the kind of like, this is the territory, you know, it's our space, enter it with respect, you know, kind of engraved on the steps as you enter the building, which is like really beautiful. How do we tell people what role we want them to take in the system? You can be very implicit, put it on the steps as they enter. In a lot of the conversations, there was a bit of understanding the history of Australia and what they call their journey towards cultural safety. This is what they're calling the journey of reconciliation and restitution that they're on. And what was for me interesting is up to, I think the 1990s, when there were some legal challenges to this, Australia's constitution was based on the legal principle of terra nullius, which basically means that there were no humans here when we arrived to colonize. And I think that's a very interesting implicit way of voicing part of it's an explicit voicing of an implicit principle behind colonialism. Just those who were here were not human. And so in the terra nullius, that was challenged in court and it's been overturned, but they're only voting now on October 14 to have the voice referendum, which is to formally recognize the Torres Strait Islanders and the Aboriginal people as having been there. And I've worked and been in Australia since 1999 was the first work contract that I did in Australia. I have family there as well, so I travel there quite often. But the interesting thing that I've never heard in their conversations, in my conversations in that country, like I heard it now, was the comment, we have not ceded our sovereignty. We have not ceded our territory. And the importance of saying that so people are making statements like, you are living on stolen property. We are walking in two worlds, the world that you've created on the land and the world that's been on this land. And the world of the head and the world of the heart is how it's also sometimes spoken about. But the importance of self-determination in the conversation in Australia is massive at this point in time. So there is this referendum on October the 14th. Interestingly, if you live in Australia as an Australian citizen and you do not go and vote in this referendum, there will be a tax penalty for not voting, which in and of itself, if we have to organize society in a different way, is a very interesting way to do things. So this is how their referendums work. You don't go and vote in the referendum, extra tax for you. Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot because I love civil involvement in politics. So part of what they've instituted, but this is by choice in organizations, is organizations can adopt what is called an organizational reconciliation action plan, which is done ideally with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait people that are in the organization and in your client base and on the land that your organization is based, to understand what reconciliation looks like and what action steps might be taken by your organization to change the way in which power is authorized, decisions are made, land is used in different ways. The interesting thing is a lot of the organizational systems have done a great job at working with people to develop these plans, but a lot of the systems are too nervous to take on the advice. And that's a deep sadness that and some of it's not that radical even. But yeah, this thing about calling it an action plan and it's a reconciliation plan, but not much happening. There were a lot of conversations around what allyship looks like, if you want to be an ally to the Aboriginal people. And a lot of it was expressed as needing to be somatically processed. So both how you show up in support of me and my agenda, and how that lands in your body, and how it lands in my body when you help me in the way that you're helping me. And so this idea of embodiment as helping us understand allyship and being open to how does this feel in your body when I stand up and speak in this context. And then also this idea of who is central in the act. Is it putting the attention on you? Because then it's not allyship, then it's an ego-driven activity as opposed to something that's supporting me. And I have spoken a lot about the challenges of doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work in liberal systems. And this was up in Australia. They said, what makes it so hard to feel safe in organizational systems where the identity of the system is very liberal is that the shadow belongs to nobody. And if the shadow belongs to nobody, then it's very hard to figure out how to change anything that's not working. Yeah. And so this was a different way of saying something that I think some of you have heard me say before. So we had a specific project. I'm going to show you about it first because it's so, so exciting. So we had the privilege of having the CEO of the Geelong Arts Centre, a theatre space, an artist who worked on the project to design the space, and the mentor who is an Aboriginal woman who's mentoring an Aboriginal artist to bring art into a very public space. All three of them were talking to us about this project. And basically, it's about public art and inclusion through public art. And there's lots of lessons. We'll come back to it. But I want to show you the art first. So this is the outside of the art center. And what this artist did, she wasn't the one who was there, is she took tea towels from more, let's call it racist eras from Australia, tea towels that were in some parts of the world part of British culture. I think that you issue these tea towels, and she blew them up really, really big and then put very provocative social justice messages over these racist tea towels. Now, these things are massive. This is like a 3-story buildings outside. Now, if you think about this kind of very confrontative art inside an arts theater, very interesting. So there was a lot of risks taken in putting this on the outside of a building. Yeah. And interestingly, what's just in front of it is a public theater space. So one of those tiered outside public art, public theater spaces, which gets used. So this is the backdrop. The artist that we did get to meet, Gerard Black, is a tattoo artist, also an Aboriginal man, who made this beautiful eel artwork that you can actually see when you walk past in the street, and it's printed on different panels, really beautiful. He spoke about his process of how he came to decide on doing the eel artwork. But the core thing is that this whole process was presented to us as an example of how to run a project in a transformational way, in a way that's aligned with the values and principles of the project, which is, in this case, to create an art center that is also a place of belonging for Aboriginal people, and that invites the conversation between white Australians and the Aboriginal people through the space in a way that's deeply honoring as well. Now, the CEO of the Art Center, who's a white guy, said one of the biggest things that changed for him through this project was he thought allyship was making space for these kinds of projects to happen and then getting out of the way. And he said the mob would have nothing of it. They said, that does not feel right. You do not get to just open the door and then easily stand on the side while we do all the hard work. What allyship looks like for us is that you make the space, thank you, great. But then you hold the space and you keep showing up in it. And you have to show up in a lot of the steps. And he just spoke in such a beautiful, open way of how it worked. And the others reflected on how it felt to collaborate with him. It seemed like just such a great partnership of trust that was built through some very tough conversations. So when they decided to do this public arts project, one of the first things they challenged him on was to say, who's on the selection panel? Who's missing from the table? Who from the Geelong community are not represented here? And then he had to find ways of bringing in representatives from other parts. So to be inclusive on the selection panel, there were 4 art pieces that got integrated into the theatre. I've shown you 2. Then the second thing is, great, this is a publicly funded building. I know that Lita will understand what I say when I say publicly funded tenders are very exclusionary things. You need degrees upon degrees to just fill in the documentation. So they challenged him to say, okay, what if this is really necessary because there's a law and it needs to be there? But the second thing is, how are you going to support the artists that do not have degrees in filling in government bureaucracy forms to fill them in? And so a whole process around going to the artists with the resources to help them, to mentor them in completing the necessary documentation is part of what was really, really special. They then got someone who has quite a lot of power and rank already in the arts community, who is an Aboriginal woman, to mentor the artists once the project had been awarded. And the mentoring was not on the art. The mentoring was on the stuff happening around power and rank of getting the art installed and getting the materials done, and the construction companies who'd come in and not listen, you know. So it was about finding voice and rank in the way that CJ actually says you need scaffolding and mentoring. If you're entering a space that you're a migrant into, provided that as someone who'd already made the journey. And she's just an amazing woman. I'll tell you more about her in a moment. And then they focused on both reconciliation and restitution in this project. So reconciliation for them was building a cultural underlay that really deeply recognizes the Aboriginal people and authorizing their stories, making the space inclusive for them, especially based on the principle that you, like, we're not trying to exclude you as white people, but we're trying right placement for whose land are we on, you know, whose culture has Australian culture been built upon in some ways. And then the restitution part was the right to self-determination in design and the right to self-determination in storytelling. And in particular, this project, more than the others, challenged the idea of who gets to say what is too provocative, or, you know, what gets to be put on the outside of a building. If I have the right to bring my art and my version of the story in this way, then that's part of what I need to fight for. And the CEO had to fight for that installation. And he did. And now it is actually accepted as, you know, so many people from all over the world come and take photos in front of this incredible thing. But yeah, it was actually quite a fight to get that past his board. And so part of what they also spoke about is, it's merging old stories and modern stories, and thinking about the ethics and design, inclusive design ethics, which is designing things with people versus designing things for people, and how that changed there's a lot more around this building and the different areas of the building and possum cloaks that are built into the inside of the theater and a whole lot of other things. It's actually very spectacular. And this story reminded me so much of, and I am going to forget his surname at this point, but there's one of the lecturers in performance arts at UCT, Mandla, I think Mbote, and he did a similar project with the Steve Biko Center in Ginsburg around ethics of design of the Biko Center. And it's so different to see how a building gets used where it's been an inclusive design building versus a building that gets designed somewhere in an ivory tower and then gets plonked into a community. So what an amazing human, what an amazing art. And yeah, he just spoke about it so beautifully, and also spoke about what this project meant for him as an individual, where as a young person, part of what he had to do was to conceal his identity for how it was received in the community, to now having his identity and his Aboriginal identity celebrated in the community, which is very powerful. So what we then did from having those sessions is we went into the space next to the art center, and Kiri Tawana, who is the mentor for that project, mentored all of us to create land-based, country-based art in an hour, collaboratively. And there was like this 5 by 3 meter canvas, and we had to start by drawing topographies, like you draw a topographical map, and then we just all had paint, and the purpose was to fill this whole thing. And every now and then she'd say, "You've been in the same place too long, move, 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 move." And we created this beautiful artwork, which is so inspirational, which she then went and cut up into 1/2 meter by 1/2 meter squares. And each person at the conference got one of these squares to take home as a way of representing the way in which the mob calls us to community. So we each got our little block, which was just so beautiful. And that we could make this amazing art piece in an hour was just wonderful. That's Silke. She's been part of IODA for a long time. She's a wonderful human being from Germany, from Dresden. And it was lovely to see her as well at the conference. So there she is with our things. So last thing I want to share is just Casey Kaminsky, who has 2 roles. She's head of people for Energy Australia, currently on maternity leave, and then also has is one of the directors for an NGO called Wombat's Wish that provides support services for grieving children in the state of Victoria. And she had an interesting conversation around her transition into thinking about work differently now that she's becoming a mother. But she just shared some data that I think is useful, and this is Australian data, but it's useful for us to think about it. She was very clear to say data is at a point in time. This is not the truth, just a sample of reality at a point in time. But in Australia, 75% of organizations see hybrid work as the new norm. That's 3 and 4. Okay, interesting. 97% of workers want flexibility. And that's not just flexibility of work from home, work from the office, but all kinds of flexibility. And she had this whole conversation around who gets to carry the burden of the stress that comes from this flexibility. Is it something that has to just go to the workers? Does the organization also carry some of that stress? How we talk about the tension in the system caused by flexibility, that we're not all at work every day, that some people have different hours that they work, all of these things. and that needs to be a conversation we need to have more explicitly. What she then said is new groups of the organizational population that we need to be more aware of because they're invisible in our stats, and some of them organizational, but some of them also societal. The first is childless and child-free mothers. So childless, people who want to have children but can't, child-free, people who choose not to have children. And she said, at this point in a company like Energy Australia, it's actually the third biggest cohort of people in the workforce. And no one talks about the reality of child-free women in the workforce. There's a lot of assumptions around how women have to, have double roles and how you need to be flexible around that. But what she says is that all the research on child-free mothers in the workforce shows that they are the carriers of a hell of a lot of resentment because they work different hours to other women. They're socially sometimes not accepted in the same way. They feel they need to talk about their pets and their nieces and nephews just to be in on the conversation in women's leadership programs. They work longer hours. They're not necessarily remunerated for that in a different way. And she said, we've only started the conversation around how to support child-free mothers in the workforce and how to understand their needs that may be different. The second group that she spoke about, she said, in her work in Wombat's Wish, it's really big, but it's a massive thing as well for parents. And that's parents who have children that are school refusers. And school refusers are a growing cohort of kids that are too anxious to go to school. And this is a massively, massively disruptive part of reality for a growing number of family systems. And interesting, it's not a conversation I've heard in diversity, equity, and inclusion conversations at all. And then she spoke a lot about Gen Y and Gen Z specifically and their needs and expectations, which we hear some of the conversations around, but also just this awareness that we may have many judgmental ideas as older people in the workforce around Gen Z's mental health needs, but this is a part of the workforce that assert their mental health. A different way of framing it is they assert their mental health needs much better than the lot that don't and burn out all the time. The older lot, the Gen Xers and the baby boomers and, those generations that I definitely belong to. So she just spoke about those three cohorts, but I was particularly curious around child-free women in the workforce as someone who does women's leadership development. Not something I've built into the conversation of my leadership programs up to now. She then spoke as well about what they've done in Energy Australia in particular is they've decided to move some of their offices into regional centers out of city centers. And that's been wonderful. But what happens is sometimes you get a regional center that becomes really popular, but it's called a pattern of ramping up and backing down in organizations. So we decide we're going to go here, and then we're all competing for the same talent, and we're actually pushing up the wages, and we because we committed to the region, we're not bringing external talent in, so we actually create stagnation in the system. And so she just said around when you choose to invest in a regional office, it's incredibly powerful because it can give you a huge amount of loyalty, and you contribute to a different part of the economy, which a big city center doesn't necessarily need. But you need to figure out your boundary conditions around where your talent comes from so that you don't create a boom and bust kind of bubble in that local economy, which is useful if you're talking to organizations that are doing that. And she said, in Energy Australia, 100% of the organizations in their value chain had been involved in cyber breaches in the last year. Now, Australia is very good at they've got legislation around needing to report these breaches. They're following it up. There've been some really big ones like the Optus breach. But how scary is this? And this is the part that, other than a lot of people somewhere in the IT world that are really worried about this, are really worried about it. But this needs to be a leadership conversation in the globe, because this is a really big deal. And Australia is just, perhaps because they are a very compliance-driven world country, just reporting on it better. And she says she thinks in large parts of the world, a huge amount of people don't even know about their cyber breaches, let alone having reported on them. And so she was just looking at what's on the edges, what are interesting parts of the conversation from the data she can see that we need to bring into organizational conversations. Fascinating, interesting ideas and thoughts. So that was the IODA conference. I cannot talk about the socio-technical systems thing. I made copious notes. I tried to put it in this presentation, and I thought this is going to add zero value because I don't understand it well enough to talk about it. But there's stuff around large room planning events, and I don't know. I don't know. I'm not even going to try. But as soon as I know, I'll come back and I'll do a supervision session around that if I decide that it's valuable. How's that? Yeah, so questions, comments before we close off for today. Maybe what we can do is just check if there are any questions, and if there aren't, then we'll do a round of what's my biggest takeout from supervision today. Questions? Just do a, okay. So let's do a closeout round. You can just unmute yourself to say, what's my biggest takeout from the IODA conference? Miriam first.
The word that keeps popping up is flow.
Mm.
From looking at how the nature was shifted, it's the flow of life, the flow of leadership, and paying attention to that stuckness and where am I stressed, and where am I, can I keep moving and move the organization forward.
Beautiful. Yeah. Thanks, Miriam. Kate, and then Joe, and then Lita.
Yeah, I think similarly, and what's really sitting with me is using ecological systems unfolding in an organization, because it just makes so much sense, right? That change the roles, change the behavior will change the system. So I really want to give more thought to that and apply it in a organizational system and see what happens. I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, beautiful.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Lucille, for all the rich sharing.
Big pleasure. Joe, and then Lita.
There were many things, including your excitement and love and passion for what you experienced. But I think what piqued my interest was the art piece, both in terms of the public art and then bringing art into the room as a takeaway, just accessing that almost spiritual side of us that's been lost, certainly in the West for a long time, back, and how one uses it in kind of quite a deep, compassionate way. So, yeah.
Yeah. It was interesting, Joe, because we had on that second day more than 10 people from the mob at the conference doing different things. Not one of them did not have as part of their identity artist.
Wow.
Even if they were just dabbling. I mean, I picked it up and I had conversations with them, and they're like, no, that's who we are. I'm an, artist is part of my identity.
Yeah. Sure.
Lita.
Yes. I just realized that that is a very small part of the country that has a community. But that is something that's missing across the world. We are so picky who's included, and do not really worry whether you are part of it. There wasn't a choice for the CEO. He had to be part of it. Whilst our CEOs will just step back and say, That's the staff.
Yeah.
That is something that is an echo for me. And it's maybe because I saw it so often in government, where it's the head of department or the ministers are not part of, they want the change, but the change starts there. We know that.
Yeah.
But it is the people in the middle and lower class or lower groups that need to bring the change. They without authority, without power.
Yeah.
Where the power sits, those people just they have all kinds of reasons why not to be part of it.
Thanks.
That's for me very obvious.
Thanks, Lita. Karen and then Rikus.
Can you hear me? My voice is barely, I've got
Oh,
a infection, so I've really been battling just to be here, but I'm glad I did because I could feel your passion and your enthusiasm. And yeah, for me also, that sense of community and those Aboriginal sort of, what you added there in terms of their involvement and, I thought it was so powerful when you all did that art together. I thought that was like so meaningful, and yeah, lots of pearls of wisdom. Thank you.
thanks, Karen. Hope your voice is better soon. Sound sore. Rikus.
Thanks, Lucille, for taking the time, the effort to share all of that. The one thing, there's many threads there. The one item that's sort of hanging around is I'm wondering how the Australian transformational process, how it compares to our own in South Africa. How very different it is, and if there is large themes, and if one can learn from one another, or if the details are too different.
Yeah. I'm thinking about this too, and part of what I was thinking about is whose land are we on? A lot, which feels like a different starting point in the conversation, because that's very complex, because we've had waves of colonialism in our country, and it's very hard to find exactly where the Griqua and the Khoisan people, for example, would be today, whose land we're actually on. So yeah, I'm thinking about that too. They ran a truth and reconciliation process that was very similar to ours about 10 years after us. And the core thing that differed there is that a lot of the process then led to a deferment of the the process of reconciliation to organizations beyond that. So there's stuff that keeps happening at a political level. They haven't enshrined things in law like the Employment Equity Act in the same way, but they are asking organizations to be in a cultural transformation a lot more explicitly. And some organizations are doing it and some not at this point in time, but I don't know where it will all go. I think the processes are similar and different, and we need to learn from each other. But this idea of you are living on stolen land and how strong the narrative is now, I think can feel in different parts of the world also. Yeah, depending on where you sit in that journey, very challenging to stay in conversation with. But that's what restitution narratives are about, right? Restitution narratives are incredibly hard. And for me, that's the core learning, is how do you stay in a restitution narrative when it scares you or angers you, depending on which side of the process you're at. The last thing that I'll share is, as we were doing that communal art, Kitty was also playing on a big screen behind us, a land art video, a time-lapse video, taken from a drone of a human in the outback, in the desert, who creates mandalas by dancing. And basically dances a little circle in the center, and then dances the lines out, and then dances this massive mandala in a process that sometimes takes something like 20 hours of dancing. And as we were doing the art, we watched this video unfold of this artwork in the sand. And what a beautiful thing that was. And, you know, the mandalas that are made of sand in the ephemeral Buddhist tradition that also then gets blown away. This is one human dancing a mandala, and the wind will take it. So whatever that means for you in your life, may you dance a mandala, and may the mob pull you back to your community. And I know for me, part of my community is the IODA community. They are wonderful practitioners all over the world. And maybe some of you want to join me in Mexico next year. Okay, thanks so much for supervision, everyone.
Thanks, Lucille.